Recording date, Galactic Standard Cycle, 3372, day 276. Location, Galactic Engineering Academy, Project Helios Division. Chief Engineer Kraltox stood before the glowing holo-display, his four arms gesturing in increasingly agitated patterns as he addressed the assembled Council of Master Engineers. His silver-scaled skin reflected the blue light of the countless displays surrounding them, creating an almost hypnotic effect throughout the vast circular chamber. "Esteemed colleagues," he began, his translator working overtime to keep up with his native Zentarian clicks and whistles. For exactly 57 years, 3 months and 12 days, Project Helios has remained our greatest challenge and, frankly, our greatest embarrassment. The assembled aliens shifted uncomfortably in their hover seats. Some had multiple appendages, others were basically sentient gas clouds in containment suits, but they all shared the same expression of frustrated defeat. If you knew how to read their species' body language, that is. Behind Kraltox, the massive hologram showed the schematics of what appeared to be the most ridiculously over-engineered weapon system in the history of the galaxy. It was beautiful, in the way that only something designed by committee over half a century could be, which is to say, it was a complete mess. The Helios particle cascade amplifier was supposed to be our crowning achievement, Kraltox continued, his secondary arms rubbing his temple in frustration. A defensive weapon capable of protecting an entire star system with a single shot. Yet here we stand, after investing 2.3 trillion credits, with nothing but a very expensive collection of partially assembled components and enough technical documentation to fill a small moon. The chamber, easily one of the most impressive rooms in the already magnificent Galactic Engineering Academy, seemed to shrink around them. The Academy itself was a marvel, a sprawling complex of crystalline spires and gravity-defying architecture that covered most of a small moon orbiting the galaxy's most prestigious engineering school. The walls were lined with achievements spanning thousands of years of multi-species cooperation and innovation. And then there was Project Helios, their one spectacular failure. Professor Zanval, a floating mass of purple tentacles from the methane-breathing Zorlak species, raised one appendage. Perhaps we should simply admit defeat, Kraltox. Even our most advanced quantum computers have failed to resolve the cascade harmonics issues. The project is, as our friends from Sector 7 would say, a lost cause. Kraltox's scales shifted to a deeper shade of silver, a sign of determination among his kind. That's precisely why I've called this meeting. Our latest simulation models have finally revealed why we've been failing all these years. The hologram zoomed in on a particular section of the weapon, a maze of quantum tunneling conduits and probability matrices, so complex it made most of the assembled engineers develop immediate headaches. "The problem isn't in our engineering," Kraltox announced, his voice carrying a mix of frustration and wonder. "The problem is that we've been too perfect." The chamber erupted in confused murmurs and the equivalent of raised eyebrows across a dozen different species. Senior Engineer Blip Boop, who had always regretted letting their offspring choose their translated name, spoke up, their crystalline form chiming softly. "Too perfect? There's no such thing in engineering." "That's what we thought," Kraltox replied, mandibles twitching in what passed for a wry smile among his species. "But look at this. Every component, every connection, every quantum state, we designed them all to theoretical perfection. And that's exactly why it fails. The system is so perfect it's practically locked in a state of quantum uncertainty. It's as if we've engineered ourselves into a corner where the laws of physics themselves are giving us the equivalent of a cosmic headache." The gathering of the galaxy's finest engineers stared at the hologram, watching as simulation after simulation showed their perfect design failing in increasingly spectacular ways. 57 years of the finest minds in the galaxy, working with practically unlimited resources. And they'd managed to create something so flawless, it was essentially useless. Professor Zanval's tentacles turned a lighter shade of purple, the Zorlak's equivalent of a facepalm. "So what you're saying is—" "Yes," Kraltox finished, all four of his arms dropping in defeat. "We're too smart for our own good. And now we're stuck with a weapon that can't possibly work because we designed it too well." The irony was not lost on anyone in the chamber. Somewhere, in whatever passed for the afterlife, the gods of engineering were probably laughing their non-corporeal heads off. The very next day, while the council was still nursing their collective existential crisis, 3 humans walked into the Academy's main atrium. Well, perhaps walked isn't quite the right word. Sarah Chen practically bounced, Mike Rodriguez swaggered, and Tom Parker simply strolled, hands in his pockets, looking up at the crystalline architecture, with the kind of casual interest one might show a moderately interesting cloud. The entire atrium, previously bustling with anti-gravity transport pods and floating data screens, ground to a halt. Hundreds of beings from dozens of species stopped to stare at the Deathworlders. The security drones, programmed to recognize and track potential threats, went into temporary overload trying to process the presence of 3 beings whose baseline vital signs registered as definitely about to explode. "Wow," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the floating screens and impossible architecture. "And here I thought MIT was impressive." Mike snorted. "Please, MIT wishes it had hover chairs. Though I gotta say, for a super-advanced alien engineering school, their cable management could use some work." He pointed at a bundle of quantum data streams that, to his human eyes, looked decidedly messy. Professor Zanval, who had been assigned as their guide, much to their tentacled dismay, drifted forward. "Welcome, welcome. You must be the, human exchange cadets." The translation matrix struggled to keep the nervous tremor out of their voice. "We weren't expecting you to arrive so directly." Tom raised an eyebrow. "As opposed to?" "Well, most new arrivals spend at least a few days in low-gravity adaptation chambers, then undergo spatial awareness recalibration, followed by—" "Yeah, we're good," Mike interrupted, pulling out a tablet and already starting to take notes on the quantum stream configurations. "Earth gravity is about as rough as it gets. This is like walking on the moon for us, just with better Wi-Fi." The gathered aliens watched in fascination and horror as Sarah casually leaned against a wall that was technically in a quantum superposition of states. According to every known law of physics, she should have either passed through it or become entangled in its probability field. Instead, the wall seemed to simply accept her presence, like a resigned parent dealing with an overenthusiastic child. "Perhaps we should proceed with the tour," Zanval suggested, the tentacles cycling through various shades of anxiety purple. "Though I must warn you, many of our advanced concepts might be challenging for your species to grasp." The 3 humans exchanged glances. Tom cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Professor, we did pass the entrance exams, the same ones every other student here had to take." Yes, of course." Zanval's tentacles twisted in what might have been embarrassment. "Though we did have to adjust the scoring matrices to account for your unique problem-solving approaches." "You mean because we showed our work using actual paper and pencils?" Sarah grinned. "Sometimes old school is the best school." As they moved through the facility, the humans' eyes were drawn to the massive hologram of Project Helios, still floating in the main chamber. Mike whistled low and long. "Now that," he said, "is either the most brilliant thing I've ever seen, or the most over-engineered mess in the galaxy." Zanval's translator glitched, trying to process the simultaneous praise and criticism. "That is Project Helios. Our most advanced, well, our most complex, that is to say—" "It doesn't work, does it?" Tom asked quietly, already walking around the hologram with a thoughtful expression. "That," Zanval admitted, "would be an understatement of galactic proportions." Senior Engineer Vex Purr stalked into the chamber on his crystalline legs, each step creating small rainbow refractions across the floor. Like most members of the silicon-based Prismari species, he had a rather rigid way of thinking, both literally and figuratively. So these are the Deathworlders everyone's been buzzing about. Vexper's voice chimed with barely concealed disdain. The ones who supposedly scored in the top percentile on their entrance exams using, what was it? Processed tree pulp and carbonized minerals? Mike looked up from where he was already elbow-deep in the Helios Prototypes access panel. You mean paper and pencil? Yeah, that was us. Though I also used a really nice eraser. It was scented and everything. Vexper's crystalline form vibrated in what might have been a scoff. How charmingly primitive. Tell me, do you also calculate quantum harmonics by banging rocks together? Nah, Sarah replied cheerfully, not looking up from the blueprint hologram she was studying. We usually just use TI-84 calculators. You know, when we're feeling fancy. Tom, meanwhile, had pulled out a beaten-up notebook and was sketching something that made absolutely no sense to the assembled alien engineers. His pencil moved with quick, sure strokes, occasionally pausing only for him to mutter something about keeping it simple, stupid. This is preposterous, Vexper chimed loudly, his crystal structure taking on a reddish hue of agitation. These Deathworlders are making a mockery of our most advanced project. Chief Engineer Kraltok, surely you cannot allow this irreverence to continue. Kraltok, who had been watching the humans with growing fascination, raised all four of his arms in a gesture of peaceful intervention. They are guests of the Academy, Vexper, and they did pass all our qualification tests. Ha! The crystalline engineer's surface facets sparkled with challenge. Then let's put them to a real test. I bet these primitives couldn't even grasp the basic principles of the Helios system, let alone solve what has stumped us for decades. Mike finally pulled his head out of the access panel, a smudge of some unidentifiable alien lubricant on his cheek. Is that a formal bet? Because where we come from, them's fighting words. You want to wager? Vexper's crystal structure prismed with amusement. Very well. If you can make any progress on this project, any progress at all, I will personally recommend all three of you for advanced placement in the Academy. Sarah perked up. And if we can make it work entirely? If you can make Project Helios functional, Vexper chimed with absolute certainty, I will eat my own crystalline matrix. Done, all three humans said in unison. What followed was perhaps the most confusing 45 minutes in the history of the Galactic Engineering Academy. The humans spread out across the chamber, ignoring all proper protocols and procedures. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by holographic schematics she kept rearranging like a puzzle. Mike had somehow managed to partially disassemble 3 different, perfect components, muttering something about over-engineered paperweights. Tom continued making his incomprehensible sketches, occasionally asking questions that seemed completely unrelated to the project. Wait, Professor Zanval's tentacles twisted in confusion. Why are you asking about ancient Earth internal combustion engines? Just thinking about timing belts, Tom replied absently. Sometimes the old solutions are the best solutions. But this is a quantum cascade amplifier. It has nothing to do with primitive explosion-powered machinery. You'd be surprised, Mike called out from inside another access panel. Hey, Sarah, remember that time we fixed the particle accelerator at MIT with duct tape and a paperclip? That was one time, Sarah protested. And it was electrical tape, thank you very much. We're professionals. Vexper's crystalline form was now vibrating at a frequency that threatened to shatter nearby beakers. This is not engineering. This is problem-solving, Kraltox finished, watching with growing interest as the humans continued their apparently chaotic but strangely purposeful work. Just not the kind we're used to. Exactly, Sarah beamed, holding up her tablet. And I think we just figured out your problem. Hey guys, remember that episode of Star Trek where they... The next 30 minutes could only be described as organized chaos, if you were being generous about the organized part. The humans moved with the kind of coordinated efficiency that made the aliens wonder if they shared some sort of primitive hive mind. Okay, so here's the deal, Sarah announced, standing up and brushing off her pants. Your quantum harmonics are too perfect. You need some controlled chaos in the system. Tom, remember that quantum physics paper about using controlled error to prevent error? Already on it, Tom replied, scribbling madly in his notebook. Mike, we're going to need to desynchronize about 30% of these conduits. Think you can make them just imperfect enough? Can a human survive on coffee and spite? Of course I can. Vex-Per's crystalline structure was now vibrating at a frequency that made nearby metal objects hum in sympathy. Desynchronize? Those quantum conduits took 17 years to calibrate to perfect resonance. Yeah, that's the problem, Mike said, already elbow-deep in the machinery again. You made it too perfect. It's like trying to drive on a frictionless road. Sounds great in theory, terrible in practice. Sometimes you need a little grit in the gears. The assembled alien engineers watched in horror as the humans began systematically ruining 57 years of perfect engineering. Sarah had pulled up the core programming and was happily deleting entire sections of quantum optimization code. Tom had somehow convinced the fabrication units to produce what he called good old-fashioned mechanical linkages, parts that seemed insultingly simple compared to the quantum-locked original components. This is madness! Professor Zanval's tentacles were now tied in literal knots. You cannot simply replace quantum-entangled precision components with parts that actually move, Mike suggested cheerfully. Watch us. Kraltox found himself oddly fascinated as he watched the humans work. Where his engineers saw perfect quantum harmonics, they saw unnecessary complexity. Where his team had spent decades trying to eliminate every possible variable, these Deathworlders were intentionally introducing controlled chaos into the system. Think of it like jazz, Sarah explained as she reworked another section of code. You don't want it too structured, or you lose the soul of the music. This is a weapon system, not a musical performance, Vex-Per protested, his crystal structure now showing stress fractures from agitation. Same principle, Tom said, not looking up from where he was installing what appeared to be a purely mechanical timing system. Sometimes you need to let things get a little messy to make them work right. The aliens watched in mounting horror as Mike literally kicked one of the quantum conduits into alignment. Percussion maintenance, he explained with a grin, works 60% of the time every time. The quantum field harmonics are completely destabilizing, one of the junior engineers cried out in alarm. Yep, Sarah replied cheerfully. But check this out. They're destabilizing in a predictable pattern. Tom, how's that timing belt coming along? Almost there. You know, this reminds me of that time we had to fix the Hadron Collider with rubber bands and paper clips. That was you? Professor Zanval's tentacles went practically white with shock. Nah, different guys, Mike laughed. But great minds think alike, you know. Sometimes the simple solution is the best solution. Sarah, how's that code looking? Sarah gave a thumbs up. Replaced about half of it with basic if-then statements. Turns out you don't need a quantum computer to decide if something should go boom or not. Binary is binary, even in space. The horror on the alien engineers' faces only grew as the humans continued their work. Where there had once been perfect quantum-locked components, there were now mechanical linkages. Where there had been millions of lines of optimization code, there were now simple command structures. Where there had been perfect harmony, there was now controlled chaos. This is impossible, Vex-Per whispered, his crystalline form now showing distinct signs of stress fractures. You're replacing quantum mathematics with common sense, Tom suggested. Look, sometimes you don't need a supercomputer to tell you if something's going to work. Sometimes you just need to know when to hit it with a wrench. Speaking of which, Mike called out from inside another access panel, can someone hand me that adjustable quantum spanner? These conduits aren't going to misalign themselves. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, or whatever passed for breathing among the various species present. As the humans continued their work, the perfect quantum harmonics that had taken decades to achieve were being systematically disrupted. The flawless coding was being replaced with what Sarah cheerfully called good enough for government work. and somehow, impossibly, the diagnostic readings were showing increasing stability. But how? Professor Zanval finally asked, their tentacles writhing in confusion. You're breaking every rule of quantum engineering. Nah, Sarah replied, closing her laptop with a satisfied snap. We're just adding a little humanity to the equation. Sometimes you need to embrace the chaos to control it. Think of it like surfing, Tom added, tightening the last bolt on his timing system. You don't try to control the wave, you work with it. Or like cooking, Mike chimed in. Sometimes you need to ignore the recipe and go with your gut. Kraltox watched as his life's work was transformed before his eyes. The perfect weapon they had tried to build for decades was being rebuilt in less than an hour by 3 humans using what they proudly called duct tape engineering. And the most terrifying part, according to every diagnostic reading they could trust, it was actually starting to work. Are we seriously going to test this abomination? Vexper's crystalline form shimmered with barely contained anxiety. The testing chamber, a massive dome-shaped room reinforced with every known form of energy shielding, suddenly felt very small. Hey now, Mike protested, patting the modified Helios weapon affectionately. She might not be pretty, but she's got it where it counts. The weapon before them barely resembled its original form. Where there had once been perfectly aligned quantum matrices, there were now mechanical linkages that looked suspiciously like they'd been borrowed from an Earth automotive engine. Half the perfect crystalline housing had been replaced with what Sarah swore was aerospace-grade aluminum, but looked suspiciously like scrap metal. Beginning pre-ignition sequence, Tom announced, his hands flying over the modified control panel. Safety protocols active, quantum field stabilizers. Well, intentionally destabilized, but in a good way. Kraltox's scales had taken on a particularly interesting shade of worried silver. Perhaps we should evacuate non-essential personnel. Nah, it'll be fine, Sarah said, making one final adjustment to her code. Worst case scenario, we only blow up this moon. Best case scenario, you guys get a working superweapon. Win-win. How is the destruction of a moon a win? Professor Zanval's tentacles were now so tightly knotted they looked like a purple pretzel. Because then we'll know what not to do next time, all 3 humans replied in unison, grinning. The countdown began. The assembled alien engineers watched in horrified fascination as the humans' hodgepodge of modifications somehow held together. The quantum field readings were all wrong, yet somehow right. The energy matrices were complete chaos, yet somehow stable. T-minus 10 seconds, Tom called out. Mike, how's that timing belt looking? Purring like a kitten. Sarah, how's the code? Running smoother than a freshman's excuses on Monday morning. 5 seconds. The room held its collective breath. Those who had breath to hold, anyway. Vexper's crystal structure was vibrating at a frequency that threatened to shatter nearby glassware. 3, 2, 1... There was a moment of perfect silence. Then, with a sound that could only be described as a quantum hiccup, the Helios weapon activated. The effect was underwhelming at first. No explosions, no catastrophic failures. Just a soft hum and a barely visible ripple in the air. Did it work? Professor Zanval ventured after a moment. Sarah checked her readings and broke into a wide grin. Oh, it worked all right. Check the test target. All eyes turned to the heavily reinforced target drone floating at the far end of the chamber. Or rather, where the target drone had been. In its place was nothing. Not destruction, not debris, just an absolute absence of anything. Perfect quantum nullification field, Tom announced proudly, completely negates any hostile energy signatures within the target area while leaving friendly signatures untouched, just like you wanted. The alien engineers stared in silence. 57 years of perfect engineering had failed to achieve what these humans had managed in 45 minutes, with spare parts and what they called percussive maintenance. But Vexper's crystal structure was now showing definite signs of stress fractures. The quantum harmonics are all wrong. The field matrices are completely misaligned. The code is is simple, Sarah suggested. Yeah, turns out you don't need a quantum computer to make quantum decisions. Sometimes good old-fashioned binary logic works just fine. And the mechanical linkages. Professor Zanval's tentacles waved at the decidedly unquantum parts. Sometimes you need something that actually moves, Mike explained, giving the timing belt an affectionate pat. Can't always trust invisible quantum bonds to do the job. Sometimes you need good old-fashioned gears and sprockets. Kraltox moved forward, all four arms extended in a gesture of amazed respect. You've done it. You've actually done it. But how? Why did our perfect engineering fail where you're chaos, Tom suggested. That's exactly why it worked. You tried to make it too perfect. The universe doesn't like perfect. Perfect is rigid, inflexible. Sometimes you need a little chaos in the system, a little humanity. The test chamber erupted in excited chatter as the implications sank in. Decades of failure had been solved by 3 humans who literally kicked the quantum physics into working. Vex Purr's crystalline form had taken on a distinctly pale hue. I believe I made a promise about eating my crystalline matrix. Nah, keep your matrix, Mike laughed. But you can buy us coffee. Real coffee, not that quantum-filtered stuff you guys drink. The aliens watched in continued amazement as the humans began running more tests, each one confirming what seemed impossible. Their primitive solutions had created a working superweapon, a weapon that could protect entire star systems, built with parts that looked like they belonged in an Earth garage rather than a galactic engineering facility. And perhaps most terrifyingly of all, the humans were already talking about version 2.0. 2 days later, in the Academy's Grand Lecture Hall, Sarah, Mike, and Tom found themselves facing a rather unusual audience. The entire faculty had gathered, along with representatives from 17 different galactic engineering societies, all eager to understand how 3 primitive humans had succeeded where generations of advanced alien engineers had failed. So let me get this straight. Professor Zanval's tentacles twisted in what might have been amusement or existential crisis. It was hard to tell. You replaced the quantum probability matrices with timing belts? Well, yeah, Mike shrugged, taking another sip of his hard-won real coffee. Look, quantum entanglement is great and all, but sometimes you just need something that goes clunk when it works. And the complex algorithmic structures I spent 12 years perfecting, another engineer asked, their gaseous forms swirling in agitation inside their containment suit. Sarah grinned. Replace most of it with if-then statements. Turns out you don't need to calculate every possible quantum state when you can just say, if bad guys show up, then make them go away. But that's... Vex Purr, who had still not quite recovered his normal crystalline luster, chimed in distress. Efficient, Tom suggested. Look, here's the thing. You all tried to build the perfect weapon. We just built one that works. Kraltox, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. Perhaps that's what we've been missing all these years. We sought perfection when we should have sought functionality. Exactly. Sarah jumped up, nearly spilling her coffee in excitement. It's like this old Earth saying, perfect is the enemy of good enough. You guys got so caught up in making everything quantum perfect that you forgot the basic engineering principle of KISS. KISS? Several alien translators glitched simultaneously. Keep it simple, stupid, Mike explained. Though maybe we should update it to keep it simple, sapient for interstellar use. The lecture hall erupted in a mixture of laughter, confused beeping, and what sounded like several quantum processors having existential crises. But the implications of this are staggering, one of the senior academicians noted, their cybernetic eyes whirring as they processed the data. If simple solutions can outperform complex ones, then maybe we've been overthinking everything, Kraltox finished, his scales shifting to a color that indicated deep contemplation. Perhaps there's something to be said for the human approach of... What did you call it? duct tape engineering, all three humans said proudly in unison. Though we prefer to call it field expedient solutions in formal papers, Tom added with a wink. Professor Zanval's tentacles had finally unknotted themselves enough to form coherent gestures. The Academy Board has reviewed your work, and we've come to a decision that may be unprecedented in our history. The humans exchanged glances. Sarah raised an eyebrow. We're not in trouble for violating about 50 different quantum engineering protocols, are we? Quite the opposite, Kraltox announced, all forearms raised in a formal gesture. We're creating a new department, Applied Human Engineering Solutions, and we want you three to help design the curriculum. Mike choked on his coffee. You want us to teach aliens how to engineer like humans? Precisely, Vexpur chimed, his crystal structure finally regaining some of its normal luster, though perhaps with fewer incidents of percussive maintenance than your demonstration showed. Hey, sometimes you need to kick it to make it work, Mike protested. That's just science. The hall filled with laughter again, but there was a new undertone to it, respect, mixed with just a touch of terror at what humans might do next. There's just one small condition, Kraltox added, his scales shifting to what might have been amusement. We need you to write up your methodology for the Academy archives, in proper scientific format, if you please. The three humans exchanged another glance before Sarah spoke up. So, you want us to write a formal paper explaining how we fixed your superweapon with the engineering equivalent of chewing gum and paper clips? Precisely. Can we title it Quantum My Ass? How Human Engineering Saved the Galaxy Through Strategic Application of Chaos Theory and Good Old-Fashioned Elbow Grease? The translation matrices throughout the hall struggled for a full 30 seconds with that one before giving up entirely. Tom pulled out his trusty notebook, now significantly more worn. You know what this means, right? We're going to have to create actual technical terms for hit it till it works, and good enough for government work. I suggest percussive quantum alignment and optimal efficiency threshold acceptance, Mike offered, with a completely straight face. As the lecture hall dissolved into another round of laughter and confused alien noises, Kraltox looked at his fellow faculty members. I believe, he said slowly, that the galaxy may never be quite the same after this. No, Professor Zanval agreed, their tentacles waving in what was definitely amusement now. But perhaps that's exactly what we needed. Meanwhile, Sarah had pulled out her laptop and was already typing. Chapter 1. Why everything you know about quantum engineering is wrong, and why that's actually right. The implications were clear. The galaxy had wanted perfect weapons, perfect solutions, perfect engineering. What it got instead was humanity-messy, chaotic, surprisingly effective humanity. And somehow, that turned out to be exactly what it needed, as Mike would later put it in their official paper. Sometimes the best solution isn't the most elegant one. Sometimes it's the one held together with duct tape, determination, and just enough chaos to make the universe sit up and pay attention. The paper, incidentally, would go on to become the most cited work in galactic engineering history, though no one ever quite figured out how to translate percussive maintenance into standard galactic properly.